The morning shift began like any other morning on Sentinel-7. Jake Morrison walked through the main corridor with a coffee cup in his hand, nodding to the scientists who passed by him on their way to the research labs. The station commander had been running this outpost for 3 years now, and he knew almost everyone by name. Outside the reinforced windows, the purple sky of Sentinel-7 stretched endlessly, dotted with the strange crystalline formations that made this planet so valuable to human research. The colony was small by most standards. 300 people called this place home, though none of them had planned to stay forever. They were researchers, engineers, medical staff, and support personnel who had signed up for 2-year contracts to study the unique properties of the planet's crystal structures. These formations had shown remarkable potential for quantum computing applications, something that could revolutionize human technology if they could understand how the crystals grew and functioned. Lisa Grant sat at her station in the communications room, monitoring the standard channels that connected Sentinel-7 to the rest of human space. She was young, barely 25, and this was her first assignment off Earth. The job was usually boring, consisting mostly of routing supply requests and personal messages back to Earth. She liked the quiet nature of the work, the way each day passed without drama or excitement. That was about to change in the worst possible way. The alarm that sounded at 0847 hours was not one that Lisa had ever heard before. It was the deep resonating tone that indicated multiple ships dropping out of faster-than-light travel in close proximity to the station. Her fingers moved across her console, pulling up the sensor data that was flooding in from the station's detection grid. 12 contacts, all of them large, all of them moving in formation toward Sentinel-7. Lisa opened a channel to the command center. Her voice was steady, professional despite the cold fear that was beginning to settle in her stomach. Jake Morrison arrived within 90 seconds, still holding his coffee cup. He set it down on a console and leaned over Lisa's shoulder to study the display. The ships were still too far away for visual identification, but their energy signatures were unlike anything in the human database. Jake told Lisa to hail them on all standard frequencies. She complied, broadcasting a simple greeting in English and the 3 most common trade languages used in this sector of space. The response came 30 seconds later, and it was not a greeting. A garbled transmission in broken English told them that they were trespassing in Krell territory and that they had been warned multiple times to leave. Jake felt his chest tighten. The Krell were known to humanity, though contact had been minimal. They were an aggressive species, territorial and hostile to outsiders. Jake immediately ordered a station-wide alert. Throughout Sentinel-7, lights began flashing yellow, and a recorded voice announced that all personnel should report to their designated emergency stations. In the research labs, scientists looked up from their work in confusion. In the residential areas, families began gathering their children. Nobody panicked yet, because nobody truly believed they were in danger. This far out in the frontier, threats were theoretical things that happened to other people. The first plasma bolt struck the communications array at 0851 hours. The impact shook the entire station, throwing people off their feet and sending equipment crashing to the floor. Lisa's console exploded in a shower of sparks, and she threw herself backward, her hands covering her face. Jake grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the emergency exit, shouting orders into his personal communicator. The Eastern Habitat Dome had been breached. Atmosphere was venting into space. They needed to seal that section immediately or lose everyone inside. Amy Foster was in Research Lab 3 when the second impact hit. The research director had been examining a particularly large crystal sample when the floor bucked beneath her feet. The crystal fell from the examination table and shattered on the floor. 3 months of careful study destroyed in an instant. But Amy was not thinking about the crystal. She was thinking about the 19 people who worked in this lab and how she was going to get them to safety. The evacuation order came through on every speaker in the station. Jake Morrison's voice, usually so calm and friendly, now carried an edge of desperate urgency. All personnel were to proceed to the hangar bay immediately. The civilian transports would launch in 10-minute intervals. Everyone needed to move quickly and follow their emergency training. Amy began herding her team toward the corridor, counting heads as they went. 19 people. She had 19 people to protect. The hangar bay was chaos. Hundreds of people crowded around the 4 civilian transports, pushing and shoving in their desperation to board. The ships were not designed for combat or speed. They were cargo haulers, slow and ungainly, meant for moving supplies between the surface and orbit. But they were the only way off the station, and everyone knew it. Station security tried to maintain order, directing people to form lines, but fear was beginning to override training. The first transport launched at 0903 hours. Amy watched it rise through the atmospheric shield and accelerate toward space. For a moment, she felt hope. They were going to make it. People were going to survive this. Then the transport exploded in a brilliant flash of light, hit by a Krell missile that had tracked it from launch. Debris rained down across the landing pad, burning metal and worse things that Amy tried not to look at. The crowd in the hangar began to scream. Jake Morrison was in the command center watching his station die around him. The Krell ships had taken up positions around Sentinel-7, forming a perimeter that made escape impossible. Every transport that launched was destroyed within seconds. The station's defensive systems, designed to deflect asteroids and small debris, were useless against military-grade weapons. Plasma bolts and kinetic missiles rained down on the facility, tearing through walls and bulkheads like paper. He knew what he had to do. In the corner of the command center was a reinforced console that housed the emergency beacon. It was a last-resort communication system that used quantum-entangled particles to send an instantaneous signal back to Earth. The message would arrive immediately, but help would not. Earth was 47 light-years away. Even the fastest human ships would take weeks to arrive. But Jake activated the beacon anyway because it was all he had left to do. Amy Foster made it to the command center, just as Jake was finishing the activation sequence. She had lost track of her research team in the chaos. She did not know if they had made it to the shelters, or if they were among the bodies she had seen in the corridors. Jake looked at her with hollow eyes and told her to get to the underground laboratory. It was the most reinforced structure on the station. If anyone was going to survive, it would be the people who made it there. The quantum signal from Sentinel-7 reached Earth Command Headquarters at exactly 0347 hours Geneva time. The night shift officer who received it stared at his screen for 3 full seconds before his training kicked in, and he slammed his hand down on the emergency alert button. Within minutes, the entire command center was flooded with personnel, some still pulling on their uniforms as they rushed to their stations. The automated distress beacon had attached a data package to its signal, and what that package contained would change everything. Admiral Richard Hayes lived 20 minutes from headquarters, but he made the drive in 12. His aide Kevin Barnes met him at the entrance with a tablet already loaded with the preliminary reports. Richard did not speak as he walked through the corridors toward his office. His face was a mask of stone, but everyone who saw him that morning would later say they had never seen such controlled fury in a human expression. He was 62 years old, a veteran of the border wars, and he had seen combat in a dozen different systems. Nothing had prepared him for what he was about to watch. The footage began playing automatically when Richard entered his private office. Kevin stood beside him, neither man sitting despite the chairs that were available. The recording showed the interior of Sentinel-7 during the attack. The station's security cameras had continued functioning, even as the structure around them died. Richard watched civilians running through smoke-filled corridors, their faces twisted in terror. He watched a young woman clutching a child, both of them screaming as a hull breach began pulling them toward the void. He watched Jake Morrison, a man Richard had personally approved for the command position, throw himself over 2 young scientists as the ceiling collapsed on top of them. The recording lasted 18 minutes. When it ended, Richard stood in silence for a long moment. Then he told Kevin to wake up every member of the Human Defense Council and summon them for an emergency session. He did not care what time it was or where they were. This could not wait for normal business hours. Kevin nodded and left the office, already making calls on his communicator. Richard sat down at his desk and watched the footage again. He needed to burn every detail into his memory because what he was about to propose would require absolute certainty. President Helen Carter arrived at the council chambers at 05:02 hours. She had been asleep in her residence when the call came, but now she Minutes, senators and military commanders and civilian advisors who formed the highest decision-making body in human space. They took their seats around the long table, and President Carter called the session to order. Richard Hayes stood and began his briefing. He did not soften the details. He showed them the footage in its entirety, forcing them to watch every moment of death and destruction. He showed them the casualty reports that were still being compiled. 300 people had been stationed on Sentinel-7. Current estimates suggested fewer than 20 had survived, trapped in the underground laboratory with limited supplies and no way to call for help beyond the beacon they had already sent. The Krell had not stopped with destroying the station. They had hunted down every transport that tried to escape, killing civilians who were trying to flee. The council chamber erupted in angry voices. Some called for immediate military action, while others urged caution and diplomatic channels. The Krell Dominion was not a minor power. They controlled 17 star systems and had a military force that rivaled humanity's own. A war with them would be costly, potentially devastating. But others argued that allowing this attack to go unanswered would invite further aggression from other species. Humanity was still relatively new to the galactic stage, and everyone was testing their boundaries. General Paul Griffin had been sitting quietly during the debate, his weathered hands folded on the table in front of him. He was the commander of Earth's expeditionary fleet, responsible for all military operations beyond the Sol system. At 70 years old, he was the oldest person in the room and the most experienced combat commander humanity had. When he finally stood to speak, the chamber fell silent. His voice was rough, gravelly, the voice of a man who had shouted orders across too many battlefields. He said that they had spent decades building a military force capable of defending human interests across dozens of light years. They had invested trillions of credits into warships and weapons and training. They had created doctrines and protocols for every conceivable threat. And among those protocols was one that had been authorized but never implemented, discussed in classified briefings but never used. The Omega Protocol. It was a battle plan designed for total war, for conflicts where humanity's very survival was at stake. General Griffin believed the situation qualified. The chamber went quiet. Everyone knew what the Omega Protocol entailed. It was not a police action or a limited strike. It was the full weight of human military power brought to bear on a single target with the goal of complete and utter destruction. It meant using weapons that humanity had built but hoped never to deploy. It meant crossing lines that once crossed could never be uncrossed. President Carter asked if there were any alternatives, any way to achieve justice for Sentinel-7 without going to such extremes. Richard Hayes stood again and pulled up a star map on the chamber's main display. He showed them the location of Sentinel-7 and the Krell home system of Dracor. He explained that the Krell had been expanding aggressively for the past decade, claiming territory and resources without regard for existing claims. They had sent warnings to Sentinel-7, yes, but those warnings had been vague and easily mistaken for pirate threats. The attack had been deliberate, calculated to send a message that humans were weak and could be pushed aside. If humanity responded with anything less than overwhelming force, that message would be confirmed. The debate continued for 3 hours. Arguments were made for restraint, for proportional response, for diplomatic solutions. But every time someone suggested a moderate approach, Richard played another clip from the Sentinel-7 footage. He showed them the child being pulled into space. He showed them the medical bay where doctors had died trying to treat wounded patients. He showed them the hangar where hundreds had died believing they could escape. Each clip was a hammer blow against moderation. President Carter finally called for a vote at 0847 hours, exactly 12 hours after the distress signal had been received. The question was simple. Should humanity authorize the Omega Protocol against the Krell Dominion in response to the attack on Sentinel-7? The vote would need to be unanimous to pass, a requirement built into the protocol itself to ensure that such devastating action was never taken lightly. One by one, the council members cast their votes. The tally appeared on the display. Unanimous approval. Richard Hayes left the council chamber and returned to his command center. He had work to do, orders to issue, fleets to mobilize. Within the hour, encrypted messages began transmitting to every human military installation in known space. The 3rd Fleet, stationed near the frontier, received orders to begin combat loading and prepare for immediate deployment. The 7th Fleet, currently on patrol in the inner colonies, was recalled to Rally Point Omega. The 9th Fleet, humanity's newest and most advanced ships, departed from Earth orbit within 6 hours. The Special Weapons Division received authorization to begin arming selected vessels with planet crackers. These weapons had been built in secret, tested in uninhabited systems far from prying eyes, and stored in classified facilities. Most people in human space did not know they existed. The scientists who had designed them had done so with the hope they would never be used. Now they were being loaded into the weapons bays of humanity's most powerful warships, ready to demonstrate what happened when peaceful researchers were murdered. Kevin Barnes found Richard standing alone in the observation room, watching the fleet mobilization on the tactical display. Dozens of ships were moving into formation, their crews working around the clock to prepare for deployment. Kevin asked if the Admiral truly believed this was the right choice. Richard did not turn away from the display. He said that 300 innocent people had died because someone decided humans were not worth respecting. The galaxy needed to understand that such decisions carried consequences. Humanity had tried being peaceful, tried being diplomatic, tried being understanding. Now they would try something else. The rally point existed in the empty space between stars, a coordinate chosen specifically because it was exactly 20 light-years from both Earth and the Krell home system of Dracor. Ships began arriving in waves, their faster-than-light drives creating brief flashes of light as they dropped back into normal space. The Third Fleet arrived first, 17 warships that had been patrolling the frontier and were already close to the staging area. The Seventh Fleet came next, 21 ships that had pushed their engines hard to make the rendezvous on time. The Ninth Fleet arrived last, 9 vessels that represented the newest and most advanced technology humanity had ever built. Admiral Richard Hayes transferred his command to the EFS Vengeance, a dreadnought-class vessel that served as the flagship of the Ninth Fleet. The ship was massive, nearly 2 kilometers long, bristling with weapon systems and armor plating, thick enough to withstand sustained bombardment. Captain Nicole Stevens met him at the airlock, a crisp salute that Richard returned with equal precision. Nicole was 43 years old and had been commanding warships since she was 30. She had fought pirates in the outer territories and defended mining colonies from raiders. This would be her first time leading her ship into a real war. The bridge of the Vengeance was a marvel of engineering. Holographic displays floated in the air, showing every ship in the fleet and their current status. Crew members sat at their stations, monitoring systems and running final checks. Richard took his position at the command center, a raised platform that gave him a clear view of the entire bridge. Nicole stood beside him, her hands clasped behind her back in the traditional military pose. Neither spoke as the final ships locked into formation. They were ready. The fleet would make the journey to Dracor in a series of calculated faster-than-light jumps. Each jump would cover approximately 3 light-years, with brief pauses in normal space to recalibrate navigation systems and ensure all ships remained in proper formation. The total journey would take 6 days, plenty of time for Richard to finalize the battle plan and brief his senior officers. He called a meeting in the war room 2 hours after departure. Commander Greg Palmer was the first to arrive. He was the fleet's tactical officer, responsible for coordinating the movements of 47 warships during combat. Greg was young, only 35, but he had graduated top of his class from the Naval Academy and had proven himself during the border wars. He spread a holographic map of the Dracor system across the table and began highlighting key features. The Krell homeworld was the 4th planet in the system, a large terrestrial world with 3 moons. Intelligence reports suggested over 100 military stations in orbit and at least 200 warships based in the system at any given time. The other senior officers filed in over the next few minutes. Captain Roger Bryant from the 3rd Fleet, Captain Linda Shaw from the 7th Fleet, and Commander Sam Carter, who was in charge of the Special Weapons Division. They gathered around the table, studying the map and the intelligence data that accompanied it. Greg began his briefing, walking them through the Krell defensive positions and the likely responses to a human attack. The numbers were not encouraging. The Krell had numerical beetle path and sensor blind spot. Richard listened to every concern, every tactical objection, every alternative strategy that his officers proposed. Some suggested a blockade instead of a direct assault. Others recommended striking military targets only and avoiding civilian casualties. A few argued for attempting one final diplomatic contact before beginning hostilities. Richard let them speak because good officers should question orders that seemed extreme. When they were finished, he pulled up the footage from Sentinel-7, He had not planned to show it to them, but he realized they needed to understand why half measures were not acceptable. The war room fell silent as the recording played. These were experienced military officers who had seen combat and death, but watching civilians murdered in their own research station was different. It was personal in a way that combat rarely was. When the footage ended, Richard asked if anyone still had objections to the battle plan. Nobody spoke. The plan would proceed exactly as written. They would enter the Dracor system with all weapons hot and engage any Krell ships that attempted to interfere. Then they would systematically destroy every military installation in orbit, and then they would use the planet cracker. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Dracor system on the morning of the 6th day. The transition from compressed space back to normal reality was jarring, creating gravitational ripples that every sensor in the system would detect immediately. Richard stood on the bridge of the Vengeance, watching the tactical display as it populated with contacts. The Krell response was exactly what intelligence had predicted. Warships began moving from their patrol routes, converging on the human fleet's position. Within 20 minutes, 300 Krell vessels had formed a defensive line between the humans and their homeworld. Richard had expected the Krell to attempt communication, to demand explanations or issue threats. Instead, they maintained complete radio silence. Perhaps they knew why the humans had come. Perhaps they understood that words would be meaningless at this point. The two fleets faced each other across 1 million kilometers of empty space, weapons charged and shields at maximum power. Nicole turned to look at Richard, waiting for the order. He nodded once, and she relayed his command to the fleet. All ships were to advance at full combat speed. No warnings would be issued. No surrender would be accepted. The distance between the fleets began to shrink. 1 million kilometers became 800,000, then 500,000, then 200,000. The tension on the bridge was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every crew member knew they were about to enter the largest space battle in human history. They were outnumbered nearly 7-1, facing an enemy that fought with savage aggression, but they also knew that they had better ships, better weapons, and better training. More importantly, they had a reason to fight that went beyond territory or politics. They were here to deliver justice for 300 murdered civilians. The Krell opened fire first. It was a classic military tactic, catching the enemy while they were still closing distance. Plasma bolts and kinetic projectiles erupted from 300 warships simultaneously, creating a wall of fire that crossed the space between the two fleets at a significant fraction of light speed. The human point defense systems engaged immediately, computers calculating trajectories and directing laser batteries and interceptor missiles. The void lit up with explosions as incoming fire was destroyed or deflected, but not everything could be stopped. The EFS Triumph, a cruiser from the 7th Fleet, took a direct hit from a Krell plasma cannon. The bolt punched through the ship's shields and tore into the port side, vaporizing armor and cutting through 3 decks. Atmosphere vented into space, carrying debris and bodies with it. But the Triumph did not break formation. Damage control teams rushed to seal the breach while the ship's weapons continued firing. This was what they had trained for, the ability to take damage and keep fighting. Richard gave the order to return fire. The human fleet's response was calculated for maximum effect. Railguns mounted along the hulls of every warship began accelerating slugs to incredible velocities. These were not explosive warheads but solid projectiles that relied on pure kinetic energy. When a slug moving at a fraction of light speed hit a target, the results were devastating. The first volley from the human fleet destroyed 23 Krell warships in less than 10 seconds. Metal and plasma exploded across the tactical display as enemy contact simply ceased to exist. The Krell formation began to shift, trying to compensate for the sudden losses, but the human fleet was already adjusting, their coordination perfect after years of training together. Missile swarms launched from the capital ships, each missile equipped with targeting systems that could track a specific ship through a debris field. The missiles spread out across the battlefield, seeking their designated targets with mechanical precision. More Krell ships died, their hulls torn apart by multiple impacts. Nicole watched her tactical display as the enemy numbers began dropping. The Krell were brave and they fought well, but they had made a critical mistake. They had assumed that humans were soft, that a species so new to the galactic stage could not possibly match their military prowess. That assumption was costing them everything. Human fighter craft launched from carrier ships, small and agile vessels piloted by men and women, whose neural interfaces allowed them to react faster than any organic brain could manage alone. They swept through the Krell formations like sharks through a school of fish. The battle raged for 4 hours. Ships on both sides died, their crews lost to the void. But the mathematics of the engagement were undeniable. For every human ship that fell, 10 Krell vessels were destroyed. The superior technology and training of the human forces was proving decisive. When Commander Greg Palmer reported that they had achieved space superiority, his voice was hoarse from shouting orders. Richard acknowledged the report with a single nod and gave the next command. All ships were to proceed to orbital bombardment positions around Dracor. The real work was about to begin. The human fleet broke into 3 assault groups as they approached Dracor. Each group consisted of multiple warships and support vessels, their formations tight and professional, despite the debris field they were navigating through. The remains of Krell ships floated everywhere, twisted metal and frozen bodies tumbling through the void. Captain Nicole Stevens ordered her crew to ignore the wreckage and focus on their assigned targets. There would be time for salvage operations later, assuming anyone cared to salvage anything from this system when they were finished. Admiral Richard Hayes stood at his command station, watching the holographic display as it updated with new tactical information. The planet Dracor filled the center of the display, a blue and green world that looked remarkably similar to Earth from this distance. 3 moons orbited the planet, and scattered between them were the defensive installations that the Krell had built over centuries. Space stations bristled with weapons. Orbital platforms housed fighter craft and missile batteries. Docking facilities serviced the warships that had survived the initial battle and were now retreating toward the planet's protective umbrella. The Krell had invested enormous resources into defending their homeworld. They had learned from conflicts with other species that orbital superiority was essential to planetary defense. Their shields could stop asteroids and conventional bombardment, giving them time to mount a counterattack or negotiate a settlement. But those shields had been designed before humanity entered the galactic stage, before anyone had seen what human weapons could do when they were truly unleashed. Richard gave the order to begin the orbital assault, and the human fleet opened fire on every military target they could identify. The EFS Vengeance targeted a massive defense platform that had been built into one of Dracor's moons. The platform was essentially a hollowed-out section of the moon filled with weapons and personnel, capable of supporting thousands of Krell soldiers and hundreds of fighter craft. It had taken decades to construct and was considered one of the marvels of Krell engineering. The Vengeance fired a sustained burst from its main railgun batteries, each slug carrying enough kinetic energy to flatten a city block. The impacts created a chain reaction inside the platform as ammunition stores and fuel reserves ignited. The entire structure collapsed inward before exploding outward in a massive fireball that consumed a significant portion of the moon's surface. Captain Roger Bryant commanded the 3rd Fleet Group that was assigned to clear the orbital space stations. These were not military installations in the traditional sense, but rather combined facilities that housed both defensive weapons and civilian infrastructure. Each station supported thousands of Krell workers who maintained the orbital industry that fed the planet's economy. Roger had argued briefly with Richard about targeting these facilities, pointing out that destroying them would result in massive civilian casualties. Richard had listened to his objection, and then shown him the Sentinel-7 footage one more time. Roger did not object again. The 3rd Fleet moved through the orbital space like a pack of wolves culling a herd. Ports. One by one, the great orbital installations that the Krell had built came apart. Some exploded immediately as their reactors overloaded. Others broke apart more slowly, their structural integrity failing as critical support systems were destroyed. The Krell aboard these stations had minutes to reach escape pods, and many of them did not make it. Thousands died in the first hour of the bombardment, their bodies adding to the debris field that was rapidly forming around the planet. Commander Sam Carter oversaw the Special Weapons Division from his command ship, the EFS Retribution. His ships were smaller and faster than the main battle fleet, designed specifically to carry and deploy the experimental weapons that humanity had developed. Sam watched as his targeting officers identified the shipyards where Krell warships were constructed. These facilities were enormous, capable of building multiple capital ships simultaneously. They represented centuries of accumulated knowledge and industrial capacity. Sam authorized the deployment of thermal lances, weapons that created a beam of superheated plasma, capable of cutting through any known material. The thermal lances fired for 30 continuous seconds, their beams visible as bright lines of light stretching from the human ships to their targets. The shipyards began to glow as the temperature inside them rose beyond what any material could withstand. Metal turned liquid and then vaporized. The carefully constructed assembly lines and manufacturing equipment melted into slag. The ships that were currently under construction were consumed, along with the workers who had been building them. When the lances finally powered down, nothing remained of the shipyards except clouds of vaporized metal slowly spreading through orbit. Captain Linda Shaw led the 7th Fleet Group against the space elevators that connected Dracor's surface to orbital facilities. These elevators were engineering marvels, cables tens of thousands of kilometers long made from materials that could support their own weight plus massive cargo loads. Each elevator could transport thousands of tons of material per day, making orbital construction and trade economically viable. They were also extremely vulnerable to attack, because severing the cable would cause catastrophic damage both in orbit and on the surface. Linda felt no hesitation as she gave the order to fire. The human missiles struck the space elevators at carefully calculated points along their length. The cables began to separate, the incredible tension they were under causing them to recoil violently. The upper sections, no longer anchored to the planet, began drifting away into higher orbits. The lower sections fell toward the surface, burning through the atmosphere like meteors. Each falling cable was kilometers long and weighed thousands of tons. When they impacted the surface, they hit with the force of nuclear weapons. Cities near the elevator bases were flattened instantly. The shock waves rippled outward for hundreds of kilometers. On the surface of Dracor, millions of Krell civilians looked up at their sky and watched their world's defenses being systematically destroyed. They had been told by their government that humanity was weak, that the mammals from Earth lacked the warrior spirit necessary for true combat. Those assurances now seemed like cruel jokes as burning debris rained down from orbit. Emergency sirens wailed across every city. Government broadcasts urged calm and promised that reinforcements were coming. But everyone could see that no reinforcements would be enough to stop what was happening above them. The Krell leadership attempted to contact the human fleet. Dozens of transmissions went out on every frequency, each one more desperate than the last. They offered surrender, negotiations, reparations for the attack on Sentinel-7. Some messages came from military commanders, while others came from civilian officials. A few were personal pleas from Krell who had human friends or business contacts, begging for mercy in the name of past cooperation. Every single message went unanswered. The human fleet maintained complete radio silence as they continued their work. Richard received all the surrender offers on his personal display. He read each one carefully, noting the progression from arrogant demands to terrified begging. Part of him, the part that had spent 40 years serving in a military that prided itself on honor and restraint, wanted to respond. But he remembered the faces of the people who had died on Sentinel-7. He remembered the child being pulled into space. He remembered Jake Morrison dying to protect his people. The Krell had not listened to pleas for mercy then, and Richard would not listen to them now. Nicole stood beside Richard as they watched another orbital platform explode on the tactical display. She asked quietly if they had made their point, if the Krell had suffered enough to understand that attacking human civilians carried consequences. Richard did not answer immediately. He pulled up a damage assessment that showed the current state of Dracor's orbital infrastructure. 70% of their military installations were destroyed. 90% of their industrial capacity was gone. Their defensive fleet had been reduced to scattered survivors hiding in the outer system. By any reasonable measure, they had achieved total victory. But Richard was not thinking about reasonable measures. He was thinking about the Omega Protocol and what it had been designed to accomplish. The goal was not simply to win a battle or destroy military targets. The goal was to send a message so clear and so terrifying that no species would ever dare attack humanity again. Destroying Dracor's orbital assets was impressive, but it was not final. The Krell could rebuild given time. They could reconstruct their shipyards and defense platforms. In 50 years or 100 years, they might even try for revenge. That was not acceptable. Richard opened a secure channel to Commander Sam Carter. He asked if the planet cracker was ready for deployment. Sam confirmed that the weapon had been prepared and armed according to protocol. The delivery system had been tested, and the targeting coordinates were locked in. All they needed was final authorization from the fleet commander. Richard looked at Nicole, then at the bridge crew who were all watching him with various expressions of anticipation and dread. He took a breath and gave the authorization code. The planet cracker was cleared for immediate deployment. Commander Greg Palmer walked across the bridge of the Vengeance with a datapad clutched in his hands. His uniform was wrinkled and stained with sweat from the hours of continuous combat operations. He approached Admiral Richard Hayes slowly, almost reluctantly, as though the physical act of delivering the authorization codes was something he wanted to delay as long as possible. When he finally reached the command station, he held out the datapad without speaking. His hands were shaking slightly, a tremor that he could not quite control despite his best efforts. Richard took the datapad and looked down at the screen. The authorization codes were displayed clearly, a series of numbers and letters that would unlock the final stage of the Omega Protocol. He had memorized these codes years ago when he first received clearance for the protocol, but seeing them now felt different. They were no longer theoretical. They were real and immediate and about to be used. Greg cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. He said that they had eliminated all military targets in the Dracor system. The Krell government was desperately trying to surrender. They had made their point. Perhaps it was time to accept the surrender and return home. Richard did not respond immediately. He set the datapad down on his command console and pulled up the tactical display showing Dracor. The planet hung in space below them, beautiful and serene despite the destruction that surrounded it. Millions of Krell lived on that world. They had families and jobs and dreams just like humans did. Most of them had never served in the military and had no involvement in the attack on Sentinel-7. They were simply civilians living their lives, unaware that their government's actions were about to cost them everything. Captain Nicole Stevens stood on the other side of the command station, watching Richard with an expression that was impossible to read. She had served under him for 5 years and had learned to trust his judgment, even when she did not fully understand his reasoning. But this decision was different. This was not a tactical choice about ship positioning or weapons deployment. This was a choice about whether to kill an entire world. She wanted to say something, to offer her opinion or ask him to reconsider, but military protocol required her to remain silent unless directly addressed. Richard pulled up the Sentinel-7 footage one final time. He had watched it dozens of times over the past week, but he needed to see it again before making this final decision. The recording played on his personal display where only he could see it. He watched Jake Morrison die protecting his people. He watched the transport explode with hundreds of civilians aboard. He watched the young woman and child being pulled into space. These were not soldiers who had accepted the risks of combat. They were researchers and families who had believed they were safe in their remote outpost. The bridge crew watched Richard in silence. Everyone knew what was being decided in this moment. Some of them agreed that the Krell needed to be punished severely for what they had done. Others felt that destroying orbital facilities and military targets was sufficient justice. Humanity no better than the Krell themselves, that crossing this line would fundamentally change who they were as a species. But none of them spoke because the decision was not theirs to make. It belonged to Richard alone. Richard turned to Greg and spoke in a calm, measured voice. He said that the Krell had not accepted surrender from the civilians on Sentinel-7. Those people had no weapons and no military value. They were scientists studying crystal formations, families trying to build a life on the frontier. The Krell had killed them specifically to send a message about human weakness. They had hunted down escape transports and murdered people who were trying to flee. They had shown no mercy and no restraint. Richard picked up the datapad and entered the authorization codes. He handed it to Nicole and told her to proceed with deployment. Nicole took the datapad and felt its weight in her hands. It was a small device, barely heavier than a book, but it felt like she was holding the fate of an entire world. She walked to the weapons control station and handed the datapad to the officer on duty. The young man looked at the codes and then up at Nicole with wide eyes. She nodded once, confirming the order. He swallowed hard and began entering the deployment sequence. Across the fleet, similar scenes were playing out on other ships as crews prepared for what came next. The planet cracker was housed in a specially designed bay on the EFS Retribution. The weapon itself was surprisingly small, only about 3 meters long and 1 meter in diameter. It looked more like a scientific instrument than a weapon of mass destruction, which in some ways it was. The device did not carry explosives or nuclear warheads. Instead, it contained a gravity manipulation system that could trigger tectonic instability on a massive scale. The scientists who had designed it had drawn inspiration from natural disasters, finding ways to artificially create the conditions that caused earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Commander Sam Carter watched from his bridge as the weapon bay doors opened. The planet cracker was loaded into a reinforced delivery pod designed to survive atmospheric entry and deep ocean impact. The targeting system had already calculated the optimal impact point, a location in Dracor's largest ocean where the tectonic plates were naturally unstable. The pod launched from the Retribution at high speed, its trajectory carefully plotted to avoid any defensive systems that might still be operational. It would take approximately 12 minutes to reach the surface. On Dracor, the remaining Krell government officials watched the pod descend through their atmosphere. Their sensors could detect its trajectory and estimate its impact point, but they had no way to stop it. Every weapon system that might have intercepted the pod had been destroyed in the orbital bombardment. They sent more desperate messages to the human fleet, offering complete surrender, offering to dismantle their entire military, offering anything if the humans would just call off whatever was about to happen. Richard received every message and deleted them without reading past the first line. The pod hit the ocean with tremendous force, punching through kilometers of water before embedding itself in the ocean floor. For 60 seconds, nothing seemed to happen. The Krell monitoring stations watched their sensors carefully, hoping that perhaps the weapon had malfunctioned or that human mercy had prevailed at the last moment. Then the planet began to die. The gravity manipulator activated deep beneath the ocean, creating localized distortions in the gravitational field that put enormous stress on the tectonic plates. The plates, which had been stable for millions of years, suddenly began to shift and crack. The first earthquake measured beyond any scale that the Krell used for such events. It originated at the impact point and rippled outward in all directions, traveling through the planet's crust at incredible speed. Cities thousands of kilometers from the ocean felt the ground begin to shake violently. Buildings that had stood for centuries collapsed in seconds. Roads cracked and buckled. Underground tunnels and transit systems caved in, trapping thousands of Krell beneath the rubble. The shaking continued for 10 minutes, then 20, then 30. It showed no signs of stopping because the gravity manipulator was still active, still stressing the tectonic plates beyond their breaking point. Volcanoes began erupting across the planet. Dormant peaks that had been quiet for millennia suddenly came to life, spewing ash and lava into the atmosphere. The eruptions were not limited to known volcanic regions. New volcanoes formed as the planet's crust cracked and magma found pathways to the surface. Within 2 hours, hundreds of eruptions were occurring simultaneously. The ash clouds began to merge, blocking out the sun and turning day into twilight across the entire planet. The temperature started to drop as sunlight could no longer reach the surface. The ocean itself seemed to boil as underwater volcanic vents tore open along the sea floor. Massive tsunamis formed and raced toward coastlines where millions of Krell lived in densely populated cities. The waves rose hundreds of meters high, walls of water that swept away everything in their path. Coastal cities that had existed for thousands of years were erased in minutes. The water then receded into massive sinkholes that had opened in the ocean floor, creating whirlpools kilometers across that swallowed ships and debris and anything else caught in their pull. The human fleet maintained position in high orbit, their sensors recording every moment of the destruction below. Richard had ordered a complete documentation of the event. The data would be transmitted to every known species in the galaxy. This was not just about punishing the Krell. It was about establishing a precedent that would protect human colonies for generations to come. Let every species see what happened when humans were pushed too far. Let them watch a civilization die and understand that humanity's patience had limits. Within 3 hours, Dracor had become uninhabitable. The atmosphere was choked with volcanic ash and toxic gases released from the planet's interior. The temperature had dropped by 30 degrees and was still falling. Earthquakes continued to shake the surface with no sign of stopping. The oceans had either boiled away or drained into the sinkholes that had opened across the sea floor. Of the billions of Krell who had called this world home, the survivors numbered in the thousands. Most of them were off-world when the planet cracker was deployed, stationed on orbital facilities that had been destroyed or serving on ships that had fled to the outer system. Richard gave the order for the fleet to prepare for departure. They had accomplished their mission. There was nothing left to do here except watch a world die, and Richard had no desire to stay for that final act. He opened a communication channel that broadcast on all frequencies, ensuring that every surviving Krell and every monitoring station in nearby systems would receive his message. His words were simple and direct. He said that humanity did not seek war, but they would finish any war brought to them. They did not forget their dead, and they did not forgive their killers. Let this world stand as testimony to that truth. The fleet jumped to faster-than-light travel, leaving behind a broken planet and millions of dead. The journey back to Earth took 6 days, the same as the journey out. The mood aboard the ships was subdued. Some crew members felt pride in what they had accomplished, believing they had delivered justice for Sentinel-7. Others felt horror at the scale of destruction they had participated in. Most felt some combination of both emotions, struggling to reconcile their actions with their self-image as protectors rather than destroyers. When the fleet arrived back at Earth, they found that news of their actions had preceded them. The data they had transmitted from Dracor had spread across the galaxy faster than they had traveled. Dozens of alien species that had been making aggressive moves toward human territory suddenly became very interested in diplomatic relations. Trade negotiations that had been stalled for years suddenly progressed rapidly. Border disputes that had seemed intractable were resolved with surprising speed. The galactic community had received the message and understood it perfectly. The survivors from Sentinel-7 were brought home to a ceremony that was both celebration and mourning. Amy Foster and Lisa Grant stood together as memorial stones were laid for their fallen colleagues. 300 names were carved into black granite, a permanent reminder of the price that had been paid and the response it had provoked. They knew what had been done in their name. Some called it justice while others called it genocide. But every human who looked up at the stars knew one thing with certainty. No one would test humanity's resolve again. The bombardment continued for 6 hours. The Krell were thorough, methodical in their destruction. They targeted every structure, every power generator, every communication relay. When their weapons finally fell silent, Sentinel-7 was no longer a research station. It was a grave. Jake Morrison died when a missile strike collapsed the command center. Amy Foster survived, huddled in the underground laboratory with 16 other people. They sat in the darkness, breathing recycled air, listening to the sound of their own heartbeats.